Well, how are you today, my brother?
Good, thank you, Aaron. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview. Well,
My
I think
pleasure.
I think what I'll start doing is just tell people who you are, and then we'll get into some of the questions.
Okay.
So I'm here with my friend Mehmet Ozalp, who is Associate Professor at Charles Sturt University, where he established the Center for Islamic Studies and Civilisation. Mehmet is an Islamic theologian, intellectual, and community activist. Serves as a Muslim chaplain at some universities in Sydney. And in 2012 was awarded the Australian Muslim Role Model of the Year, and is the author of many books. So a very remarkable person in the Australian Muslim community and also in the interfaith area. So welcome to you, my friend.
Thank you. I feel welcome. Thank you very much, Aaron.
So as you know, but I'll say for the people watching, we worked on a book project together, and last year at the Center for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue we participated in a symposium, and that symposium led to this book, World Religions and Their Missions. And various religions are discussed in the book, and you wrote the chapter on Islam. In your chapter in that book, you write about Islam as a global missionary religion. The Pew Research Center's Global Futures Project recently released demographical data which reveals dramatic worldwide growth for Islam over the next 40 years. The data suggests that by 2050, Muslims and Christians will sort of nearly be equal in number across the global population. While some of that growth is due to fertility rates and overall populational increases, there's also an increasing number of people converting to Islam. You know, people have been asking me, what is it about Islam that is attractive to so many people today?
Fantastic question to start with, Aaron. While I was doing that chapter, which was on dawah or mission in Islam, you know, its sense of propagating its message across to the world and other people, one thing that became clear when I looked at the history of that development was the access to people, access to Muslims. I think this is central to the success of Muslims in that, or success of Islam in the world as a growing religion. The more people have access to Muslims, in that then they have a chance to see Islam and talk about it and discover Islam, and then they can evaluate themselves and see whether it is true religion for them, and they want to embrace it. So being in the world in that Muslims are spread across the globe, I think that's one of the most important factors in that although Islam does not have a missionary class, every Muslim, or not every Muslim does it, but there are large numbers of Muslims who just go about in their everyday business and then talk to people about their religion, and that's one of the reasons why it's spreading. But obviously that access is not enough. Then people have to see something valuable in Islam. And I think there are, we could mention three things that are at the core of it. The first one is that Islam offers a simple but yet profound theology. The beliefs that, you know, Islam talks about existence and unity of God, the afterlife, that God has sent messengers to all nations across the world, and there were prophets throughout human history passing this message. An important aspect of this theology or beliefs is that it makes sense. Like a lot of Muslims tell me this, that obviously there's an element of faith in there, like you have to believe in something unseen, but it can make sense to people. They can find some reasons and evidence to believe that it is true. I think that's very important, especially for contemporary people who have a rational mind, who want science and so on. And then Muslims generally don't see a problem with science. Second aspect is that spirituality of Islam, and Islam offers a direct relationship with God without any intermediaries, that when you pray 5 times a day you're establishing a live connection with God, and you can make prayer outside of that, and I think that's important as well. Like, Muslims experience a very high level of spirituality or connection with God, and that sort of satisfies them. And thirdly, finally, I think Islam has a social message as well, something that to stand up for truth, to stand up for justice, equality of all human beings before their Creator. Like, these were the fundamental messages that resonated with people at the time of Prophet Muhammad, and they continue to do so in our time.
I mean, it's wonderful how you break it into the 3 elements. I know that Islam is called a complete way of life, or a din.
Yes.
And it's what I hear you saying is it connects with people on an intellectual level, but also on an emotional, emotive way, and also culturally and socially.
That's right, and it does have also guidelines and some teachings. It's not too heavy in that there aren't too many do's and don'ts, but there are some which gives some order and stability to the people's lives, especially in a changing world. And the daily prayers, the fasting, and other aspects of Islam. And if for people who practice it, it's a profound experience.
I mean, this really connects well with what we've been talking about in the class. We've looked at the Shahada and talked about sort of the minimalism of it, that it's not a heap of rules, it's some very simple testimonials at the start. And in terms of...
Exactly. And at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, he even said half of the Shahada. He said, say La ilaha illallah, there's no deity but the one and only God, and be saved. Tuflihu, he said, be saved. He didn't even include the second half. But naturally, by implication, when someone accepts that coming from him, they also accept him being a messenger of God. But that was the simple message in that early stages of Islam. And I think for a lot of people, without any complex theology, just the fact that God exists, He is one, purely, there's purity in that and simplicity. And people, if I can understand it, they can find evidence in their reasoning, various arguments. And then they say, well, if God exists, then I need to relate to Him. And then Islam says, well, here's a way to do that. And provides that, once again, a practical approach, even though it may seem difficult for people of our time, but I think in general it's a nice balance between balancing this world and the next.
Well, that's wonderful. So these are things that are attracting people to Islam globally. Let's move from the global to the local.
Sure.
In Australia, Muslims are statistically a much smaller segment of the population.
Yes.
And in spite of that, it's ironic and dreadful how Muslims in Australia seem to be under constant watch by the media and are often subjected to discrimination and violence. Here in Queensland, the mosque in Toowoomba has been firebombed a number of times, just as one example. So I wanted to ask you, what are the key challenges facing the Muslim community in Australia?
Well, Muslim community is under a lot of pressure, as you said, and this comes from internal pressures and also external aspects. Internally, very quickly, I can say that there are layers of complexity within the Muslim community. Firstly, most Muslims came into Australia, and it's been a few decades. They still have not concluded their migration process. They haven't settled properly. They haven't been able to integrate properly. Secondly, there are generational transitions that are going on. The first generation migrants are leaving leadership positions in Moscow or community organizations to second generation Muslims. Sometimes that has good results, and sometimes the second generation Muslims do not have enough experience. But we're seeing good aspects of that as well, because second generation Muslims can relate better to Australians. I always say if 9/11 happened in 1991, we would be in a far worse situation than what we're in today. And also there are multi-ethnic...
Can you say what you mean by that? If 9/11 happened in 1991, the Muslim community would be in a far worse situation.
What I mean by that is that in 2001, at least there were enough second-generation Muslims who knew English well, they understood Australia, they could respond to it in a positive sense and provide leadership to the community in terms of using that 9/11 to grow understanding and dialogue between Muslims and the rest of the society. If it happened in 1991, like for myself, I was just going to the gym or, worried about other things, hobbies and things like that. I don't think Muslim community was in a position to respond. Certainly the first generation Muslims did not know English well. And then who knows what would happen. Then the whole community just open to criticism and pressure, and perhaps we could have people unable to express themselves in meaningful ways or dialogue could have resorted to violence. I don't know, just guessing there. There's also layers of complexity in this Muslim community is made up of ethnic sub-communities, and there are cultural differences. There are differences in their arrival to Australia. So it's not a very homogeneous community as well. Although I should say that there's a layer of leadership that's growing that are integrating as well. Added to that, Muslims are at different levels of practice of Islam. Some are very good, or they practice a lot, some less, some they don't even look like Muslim, to the outsiders.
Sure.
So it's a very complex community, and at the same time it's growing rapidly as well. So that's the internal pressures. Externally, the main things are what happens elsewhere in the world. Muslims feel that they have to answer for it in Australia, and that puts a tension, because they feel, well, I'm not responsible for that. Why do I have to condemn all these events, terrorism that's happening elsewhere, and somehow defend ourselves when we didn't do anything? There is political pressure on Muslims to say that either integrate or leave the country. There's Islamophobic segments in society that are putting lots of pressure, like protesting to opening of mosques or schools, which are fundamental institutions that every community needs. But what's more enduring, and perhaps at the heart of all of this is that there is a negative discourse about Islam in the Western societies. Jonathan Lyons, he wrote a book called Islam Through Western Eyes. I suggest to have a look at that. He says that in that book, his main argument is that there are certain social institutions and social groups that stand to benefit from a negative perpetuation of a negative discourse about Islam. And one dramatic aspect of that, the media seems to always portray Muslims in a certain way, and then Australian Muslims have to struggle against that, in that they have to correct that and waste time and resources to deal with that problem. A minority of Muslims see that as an attack on Islam and themselves, and can then become radical.